3.
Chapter 3. Is there anyone who needs a Bible, who doesn't have a digital Bible? We have also an analog Bible. No?
Bible.
Otherwise, raise your hand if you need a Bible. Jonas is coming with Bible right there. We can pray a short prayer for Benjamin. Lord, we pray for Benjamin. We pray that you would bless him and fill him with the Holy Spirit. Put wisdom into his heart and his mouth, Lord. Let us receive your word. Let us receive your wisdom. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Yeah. Then it works great. Yeah. If you have a Bible, you can open it at Nehemiah, where, however you say it in your own language. Chapter 3. We'll use it later on a little bit. Yes, today it's about Nehemiah 3. And the topic is, what does that text mean for my personal life, for me today? It's a little bit a weird text. I don't know if you read it once or if you have it read recently. But we are right now this year preaching through the Bible. Last year we read through the Bible as a congregation together in 1 year through the whole book here. And we preached also from these passages that we read about. And this year we're looking a little bit closer about the specific chapters and books. So we have just one chapter today. A little bit an overview of that. But first I want to give you 3 things that I want to give you home today. The first thing is an interest in the Bible, to read this book from cover to cover, over and over again, maybe once a year or over 2 years, or how fast you can get. The second thing is to give you a bigger overview of this chapter, or actually the whole book. This is not just like a bibliothèque with different stories or different books. It's one continuous story. So give you a little bit a bigger overview of this whole thing. And then showing a little bit, pointing to the future. Where will we go? And where are we right now today in our own lives? About the book of Nehemiah, it's about the time 445 BC, before Christ. And Nehemiah was a cupbearer at the table of King Artaxerxes of Persia. It was in the time of the exile, Babylonian exile, or shortly after that, people from Israel, they were deported to Babylon, and then some of them, they are still staying in Persia. Some of them went back already. Yes. And this Nehemiah, he goes back to Jerusalem to build up again the wall of Jerusalem. But what's this chapter 3 about? We have in chapter 1 and 2 the story before he went back and he's inspecting the wall. How is it and where do we have to build it up again? And now in this chapter it's just about people building up this wall. There are many names named there. It's about a couple of facts about how they built and where they built and who built with whom together. And if you read it in one take, you probably fall asleep if it's in the morning or in the evening or after lunch when you're tired anyway. It's a long description from different persons, but not very interesting. It doesn't feel like a book for a preacher to choose to just preach about on Sunday, because it's not that big theological part like, for example, Romans, where you can preach about things theologically that are very interesting for Christians, for us today. But this building instructions or description, what is that? I will read a short passage that you get a feeling of it. But I won't read the whole thing, it will take too long and not give us any information that is really useful. Then Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brothers, the priests, and they built the sheep gate. They consecrated it and set its doors. They consecrated it as far as the Tower of Hananel. And next to them the men of Jericho built, and next to them Zachur the son of Imri built. The sons of Hasanah built the fish gate. They laid its beams, and it set its the doors, its bolts, and its bars. And next to them Meremoth the son of Uriah, son of Hakoz, repaired. And next to them Meshulam the son of Bericham, son of Mechatzbel, repaired. And so on. Next to them that one repaired, and next to them another one repaired. It's a nice text if you're maybe an architect and want to know how to build as fast as you can. But for our lives today, it's interesting that when we read texts or stories out of a Bible or other stories, worldly stories, we often take a very fast moral out of it. A moral story, maybe as David and Goliath, you can say, as bigger they come, the farther they fall, or the more they fall. The bigger they come, the harder they fall, or the more clever you are and talented. It doesn't matter how big you are, you will conquer the big one and have a victory out of that and have success. But there may be a deeper meaning in that story of David and Goliath. And also Esther, for example. Esther listened to her uncle and had success because she was obedient to her uncle and to God. But it's not about being obedient for us today to our uncles. There's somehow a deeper meaning in that whole thing. And I think also in this chapter, maybe in Nehemiah, there's a deeper meaning than just how to build a wall or leadership strategies. It's not about delegating or organizing our lives or our church or our companies. That's maybe also true, but I think there's something deeper in it. You have to understand this in a bigger context, in a context of the whole Bible. But what is this book actually about? How do we understand the Bible? I think we see it here in the congregation, or I see it not as a Book of Mormon, how Joseph Smith says it about the Book of Mormon, that God wrote it, that came down with golden letters and he found it, but it's a book written by humans in their language that they spoke at their time. So it's a humanly book written by humans, and they wrote down how they experienced their lives with God, how they experienced God working in their daily lives, in their things they experienced. And they used their vocabulary to describe the things because they had no other words. And they wanted to transfer a message to us, to deliver a message through these words, through these texts. But at the other hand, it's a story. There is a divine author behind it. There's God who somehow guided this many people who wrote this book, that it's a bigger story and it's all together. It's one large thing from a divine author behind the authors who had the bigger overview of it. Not just like Nehemiah's story here, they built the wall, but from the beginning to the end, a bigger overview. It's also both a humanly book and a divine author behind it. A very interesting and nice thing, this Bible, the book. It's God's story written with humans. And I have a tool that a friend of mine invented in a bachelor thesis. It's this called Narrago. It's narrative gospel. It's the Bible from covenant to covenant through the whole Bible. from the beginning to the end, from one cover to the other cover, you can say. It's from the paradise through the specific things that happened, the big things where God says to mankind, I will, for example, Noah, I will not bring destruction over mankind as I did this time there. Or then to Abraham, the promise that your offspring will become a big folk, a big people, folk of Israel. And then over and over again, a covenant with mankind that God did. So God's story written with humans, the Bible. At the first glance, we come back to Nehemiah. At the first glance, this chapter is boring, and we could teach some leadership and teamwork strategies. But I think there's a deeper thing, and that's why we're looking a little bit closer into the directly shorter history of Nehemiah and where he lived in, and also this chapter. From the beginning on, I think it was Ezra and Nehemiah, the two books that coming after each other, were one book because they tell a story from where it started until another thing, like 3 different parts in the story. The first part, and each part is the same pattern. There is hope in the beginning, and they start to do something, and then in the end, it's not as they expected to end it. So 50 years after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and went to the exile, there is the first man, Zerubbabel, in the book of Ezra, chapter 1-6. And he's rebuilding the temple. So God was there in the temple. They could meet God, or they had a place where they knew God is near us in Israel, in this country. But without the temple, where is God? God is somehow not near us anymore. So he went back to build up this temple that God could come again. And they had a promise. There are hopes after the exile, so promises from prophets before, from time to time again. They promised to the people of Israel some things. For example, a future messianic king in Isaiah 11 or Hosea 3. And God's presence in a new temple. For example, in Ezekiel 40-48 or Zechariah 2. And God's kingdom over the nations will bring God will bring his blessing through this kingdom and through this new city that will come. And through that also the fulfillment of the prophecy and the promise to Abraham that through his offspring God will bring blessing to all the people of the world. So Zerubbabel went back to Jerusalem building up the temple, and they expected it's the new temple. And God will be present there, and there will be some clouds and smoke will come down, and God will come down, his presence will be there, and it will be wonderful. But God didn't come this way, so it was not as they expected. And then after that, 6 years later, Ezra came, the next person, in Ezra chapter 7-10. And he went back to Jerusalem to teach and preach as a teacher and preacher. And actually Artaxerxes sent him to teach the Torah to the community, to Israel, and build up the community. Just some people living there. And he had the task to form this community again, to build it up. But he didn't really succeed. And it's somehow another strange ending to the story. It's not like this new Jerusalem that they expected to be God living there in the temple and everything fine. Somehow people, they were angry to each other because that's just how humans are, somehow. And then here Nehemiah came, 445 before Christ. And he was at the palace of Artaxerxes. And his brothers came and told him, Jerusalem is suffering, the city is destroyed, and there is no protection around them, no wall, and it's not in good shape. And many people are not following God anymore. So it's not so as it used to be as King David's time or Solomon's time, where everything was like perfect, almost wonderful. So Nehemiah cries to God, God, you are wonderful, but your people, they are suffering. Help us. Do something. And then God calls him to do something, to go back. And here is an interesting thing about Nehemiah. He prays first to God, do something. And then before Nehemiah do something, because God is calling him, he prays again to God. Please let the king be pleasant with me when I am before him and serve him the wine and the drinks and the food, that he will be pleasant with me, and that I maybe can raise a question to go back. And it turned out this way, that the king was pleasant with him and sent him back to Jerusalem to build up the wall. But there he faces trouble again somehow in the end. So it starts with hope, these three times in the stories, and it ends with disappointment. It's not like we expected it to be, not the New Jerusalem, not God living there with the people, not that holy people, not that holy Israel, that it was again, or that the promise for the future was it will be again. They expected it to be after this exile. That's the bigger story about it. And this whole thing points out the need for a transformation of the people's heart. People are not ready, or they're not able to live in peace with each other, to live as God expected them or intended them to live, as it was in the beginning in paradise. It was not paradise there after Nehemiah. So they need a transformation of people's heart, a new heart, as for example Jeremiah 31 exclaims there, or in Ezekiel 36. This is climax of the whole thing, the main line of this story we get out, the bigger story. And a little bit closer view to chapter 3 again. So we went from the big story, zoomed in a little bit to the environment of Nehemiah, and now to this chapter 3. Close up. Nehemiah is not named in the whole chapter, but he's organizing the whole thing in from the back somehow. They're going counterclockwise from gate to gate, so through the wall, and name the gates, for example, the sheep gate, and the next gate, the fish gate, and so on. And for example, also the dung gate. I found a picture on Wikipedia. We have the dung gate here in a second. Yeah, this is the dung gate, the new one in the today's wall of Israel. That was the part where they brought out the dung from a city to the fields. And we have another picture from the old gate. So we see here, it's from 1952, before the renovation of the wall, the new renovation. And we see here, this story is not just like a story, it's actually real, it's historic. We have the wall there, and there are even today some parts of the stones that Nehemiah's people placed there, I read. So it's a long story in this wall today, actually. And then, yes, we have the bigger picture of the whole wall, where we see how it looked like the dung gate there, and down to the left. And this whole chapter 3 goes around this wall and describes who built where around from gate to gate. Yeah, I think it gives you an impression how it looked like in the times of Nehemiah. And there's an interesting thing about the words that we see. They name all the gates and the place where the people built up, and people are working next to each other. So next to them and next to them and next to them. That seems to be an important part, next to each other. It's the most named word in this chapter, next to them, or the phrase. So to build everyone together, close to each other. And it were men and women. If you read it carefully, you see it's men and women. It's people from every part of the society. Clergy, farmer, also priests and the tax office man, the goldsmith. Everyone was there and building together around this wall to let it become strong again. We could now say we can get out of it. God's people need a plan to be successful. And they need a leader. And we as a congregation, we have a plan somehow. We want to raise funds to employ a pastor. We are few people in our church who do a lot of things, but we are kind of next to each other. We build together. We are active together. And it's important to see that it's kind of the whole people of God who are this church. And I think this is a nice example of cross-culture, because sometimes in other churches, in bigger churches, you have, mostly in modern churches, like the employed ones and the people that come and just consume. And this chapter shows us it's not like this, that Nehemiah was there and built for them, and all the others, they cheered and were around, and then they went home for sleep and food and everything again. But everyone was there building together. Most churches today live in a little Christian bubble, and they reach churchy people who had somehow contact with churches in their past, grew up in churches, Sunday school or so, or know what a church is. And churches reach them and they come maybe back to church again, but the other persons, where are they? They are not really in church. So most people also in churches and in this congregation, I think in today's society, they live amongst people who are atheists, Muslims, secularists. They have no connection to the church anymore. So we need to go out to them in our daily lives. We need to be more as people who are willing to go out and live church there. It's not about just Sunday services in church, but mainly weekdays is church day. At our work, in our sports club, in our parents' groups, maybe when we get a new child, we meet us with other people who have children that we did not know before. There where we meet people to be alive, to be church, to somehow tell what we experience with God. I think many of these people who built the wall there, they built that because they had a bigger vision, they had a plan, they knew what God did in the history, like with their forefathers, and that God really changed things in their lives and kept their promises. And that's why they were investing there. We need to be more out there as individual Christians, I think. And I think as a person in front of you who is teaching to you some things, I can encourage you. It's not only me. I think I'm at the same level as you are in many points, and maybe not the best one when I go out to work to talk with my friends about God. So you are as able as I am to talk to them. And as a church, it's maybe our task to encourage you, to equip you to talk to your friends and work colleagues about what? About God, and to give you some vocabulary. And I have here a little tool, another thing. It's very simple, that maybe could help you to talk to your friends and give you vocabulary to explain about the gospel. Maybe you heard about that before. 4 points, very easy to tell the gospel. The next slide. It's about God loves me, I live apart from God. Jesus gave everything for me. Will I choose to follow Jesus? You can tell it very short or explain what these symbols mean for you. How do you experience God's love in your daily life? For example, for me, it is sometimes in winter times I'm a little bit depressive, and then I do not see the meaning of life or other things. But what's left always is God who's carrying me, and I know He's here, His presence on her, He's real. And it's not to explain in words, but it's more a feeling, and I know God loves me, God is for real. And so on, you can explain it, how you experience it in your daily lives, and how Jesus gave everything for you, that you can reach God again. And there are also, the 4 is not just like these 4 symbols, it's also like these bracelets with the 4 symbols that you can wear at work or wherever. And then people maybe ask you, what is this? Can you explain me this? And then you have the chance to explain this to your friends about God. You do not have to make the first step and ask them, can I tell you about God? But then they ask you, what is this? And then you say, oh, this is very important in my life. It's about God. And they, what God? And then you can explain because they asked. It's a very nice thing. Yeah, to equip you to talk to your friends about that. That was about some practical things about the closer view of the chapter. And in the beginning I said there's maybe a deeper meaning in it. It's not about just leadership training or strategic organization of your company or church. It shows also this little part in a bigger context towards something, deeper meaning, who is also for us today very relevant. It's not just they built a wall there because it was before Christ in a completely different society and environment. For them, it meant they needed a wall not to be separated from like their neighbors, but from other people around who wanted to destroy their houses to get their food, their money and everything. They needed some security. And I think it's not right for us today to build up a wall between us and others, how they did it, like between them and the other people. It's not our part, nor our job today to build walls between me and our neighbors or other country people and to lock them out of our churches, of our community. And it's also not our job to call curses over others or to ask God not to bless them. That's then in chapter 4 where Nehemiah curses the others and asks God, do not bless them, do not forget their sins. I don't think that's our job today because it's another time and it's God who does it for us. It's not we have to build walls. But maybe it's symbolic for us today for another thing, the walls of salvation, who keep us secure of other things that want to distract us, to keep us away from God. This wall is very important. It's more about the spiritual thing for us today, the wall of salvation. And we see this in, for example, Isaiah 26, verse 1 to 2. We have a strong city. And if you read it, maybe you think it's Jerusalem. But then it continues, He sets up salvation as walls and bulwarks. Open the gates that the righteous nation that keeps faith may enter in. So he's pointing not to Jerusalem, but to the future, to something bigger, symbolically. We have a strong city. To the New Jerusalem that they hoped for. He's pointing to that. And also Nehemiah here, the whole book or the person, is not pointing to that Jerusalem that they are building, or not just to that, but to the ultimate Nehemiah, Jesus. We have the next slide, yeah. Ultimate Nehemiah, Jesus. In the Old Testament, Jerusalem, even there, was a sign for something bigger who will come. And not literal walls, but the walls of salvation going to save us from sin, brokenness, and death itself. Not just from foreign countries, not just from the other people who will destroy us, but from sin and brokenness and death itself. And when we open up the Bible, we see it on almost every page that it points to Jesus, that it points towards the future, something bigger. And to compare the two names of Nehemiah and Jesus, there's also interesting to see that they are very near. Nehemiah, it means Yah comforts. So God, Yahweh, comforts. And it meant to the people there, God cares about you. It's not just He forgot you, but He cares about you and sent you someone to build up the wall there. And God did not forget about us, but did send Jesus to save us and to build protection, the walls of salvation around us. Jesus, Yeshua, means Yahweh rescues, delivers. So it's not only comfort, not only comforting us, but rescues actually from everything. And it's pointing He's making us not citizens of this city there, but of the new city that will come, of God's kingdom. And the pearls are there also. The ultimate Nehemiah, he was in a palace there with the king, but he left the palace to raise something for the people there, for Israel. At the risk of his life, he left the palace. It was very comfortable there, and then he went out and facing lots of trouble. Jesus was also in a palace, was with God, and he left this palace, came to us, not of the risk of his life, but of the cost of his life, to save us, to make us citizen of the ultimate city, the new kingdom, the new Jerusalem that will come. And it's not only then, but also today, where we experience that God is for real somehow. And it sets us free, that Jesus came, sets us free from captivity, from struggling, from problems in our daily lives. He will set us free from them, sometimes today, but then for eternity, a new life that will be perfect. And here we have the next slide, again the overview of the whole thing. You have the beginning and then different parts that point towards that Jesus. Next slide. Toward that cross. And also in the time between the crown, King David, and Jesus, there was Nehemiah, and he was pointing to the final, to the ultimate city. To the ultimate Nehemiah first, and to the ultimate city also, like the end, the tree there, just one tree, the paradise. And we are now in the time between, in a church time, somewhere between Jesus and the end. Somehow how Nehemiah was in the time between exile and salvation and Jesus. We are in the same position as Nehemiah, but in another time, with other problems, but it's pretty much the same. And so I think not only Nehemiah was called to point to Jesus, but we are today also called to point to Jesus and to that future that will come, to the ultimate city, to the new Jerusalem. And I hope you can take a little bit from Nehemiah's encouragement and his story into your daily lives and how to handle with that and with God, and to trust to Him, to maybe pray first and see that God actually does the thing. It's not about us primarily to do many things, but it's about God and Jesus, about Jesus who does this in our lives, and we can point to Him and share it with others, that God does it for us. Jesus and the ultimate city. Amen.